There is a specific kind of purgatory reserved for those who must suffer fools in silence. It usually takes the form of a fluorescent-lit breakroom, smelling faintly of burnt coffee and old microwave popcorn, where the most willfully ignorant people on earth gather to loudly broadcast their worldviews. My husband, Soren, knows this purgatory intimately. He is a man who possesses a patience that borders on the supernatural, a quiet observer who prefers the comfort of organized inventory over the exhausting theater of office politics. But even saints have their breaking point, and Soren's arrived not with a dramatic explosion, but with a heavy glass bowl of leftover miniature chocolate bars. Soren manages the logistics and back-end inventory for a large, regional supplier of commercial landscaping equipment. It is a massive, cavernous building divided into two distinct worlds. Up front, there is a gleaming showroom with polished concrete floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a long mahogany counter where he occasionally steps in to assist contractors and retail customers. But the majority of his 40-hour week is spent in the sprawling warehouse in the back, a dimly lit labyrinth of heavy steel shelving, smelling permanently of vulcanized rubber, two-stroke engine oil, and industrial cardboard. The physical labor of the backroom never bothered him. What drained his spirit was the constant, inescapable auditory assault from the shipping desk. The desk was the domain of three coworkers who had formed a tight, impenetrable echo chamber of miserable opinions. There was Bram, the senior shipping coordinator, a man who seemed to communicate exclusively in loud, chewing-punctuated grievances. Beside him sat Tamsin, the dispatcher, who treated every mildly progressive social concept as a personal insult to her existence. Rounding out the trio was Cormac, a younger clerk whose primary function was to chuckle approvingly at whatever Bram or Tamsin said, desperate for their validation. Because Soren's workstation was situated just 20 feet from the shipping desk, separated only by a chain-link inventory cage, he was a captive audience. He would stand there scanning barcodes and counting replacement blades for industrial mowers, while the trio dissected the morning news. They never actually discussed their jobs. Instead, they spent hours regurgitating political talking points they had memorized from angry television hosts, completely oblivious to the fact that their own productivity was practically non-existent. Soren vehemently disagreed with almost everything that echoed out of their mouths, but he kept his head down. Arguing with people who were entirely immune to logic was a fool's errand, and he valued his paycheck more than the fleeting satisfaction of a debate. But on a damp, dreary Tuesday afternoon in early November, the trio's conversation crossed a line that made Soren's jaw lock tight. He was auditing a shipment of heavy-duty alternators, his hands coated in a thin layer of machine dust. Over by the shipping desk, Bram was leaning back in his swivel chair, his work boots propped up on a stack of unmailed invoices, tearing into a greasy foil-wrapped breakfast burrito he'd ordered through a delivery app. Between wet, heavy bites, Bram brought up a recent news article about the reduction of government assistance programs, specifically SNAP benefits. Tamsin immediately seized the topic, practically vibrating with self-righteous indignation. She stopped clicking her mouse and leaned over the desk. She loudly proclaimed that anyone relying on food assistance was simply lazy. She used the word freeloaders, her voice dripping with a sneering, unearned superiority. Bram nodded vigorously, a piece of scrambled egg escaping his mouth and tumbling onto his flannel shirt. He swallowed hard and launched into a tirade about how nobody wanted to put in an honest day's labor anymore. Cormac, right on cue, chuckled and added that these people just wanted everything handed to them on a silver platter. "They want free stuff," he said, dragging out the vowels to mock the invisible, impoverished masses they were so thoroughly condemning. Soren stood motionless behind the chain-link cage, the cold metal of an alternator housing dug into his palms. He listened as these three individuals, who had collectively spent the last 2 hours scrolling on their phones, eating delivered food, and ignoring the actual work piling up around them, complained about the laziness of others. They spoke with absolute, terrifying conviction, entirely devoid of an ounce of empathy or self-awareness. They viewed any form of help as a moral failing, a disgusting handout that offended their delicate sensibilities. Soren bit the inside of his cheek so hard he tasted copper. He quietly placed the alternator back on the shelf, grabbed his clipboard, and walked away before the urge to hurl a wrench across the warehouse consumed him. He carried that tight, coiled frustration home with him. When he walked through our front door that evening, the tension was practically radiating off his shoulders. I knew better than to press him immediately. Instead, I poured him a glass of water and let him decompress on the living room sofa while I tackled the chaotic aftermath of the weekend. It was the week after Halloween, and our dining room table was currently occupied by a massive, overflowing plastic cauldron of candy. We live at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac that notoriously sees very little foot traffic on Halloween night. Anticipating a rush that never materialized, we had severely overbought. We were now the reluctant owners of at least 6 pounds of premium name-brand chocolate. It wasn't the cheap, waxy filler candy either. We had full-sized peanut butter cups, thick caramel nougat bars, and heavy, foil-wrapped chocolate truffles. I was tossing handfuls of it into smaller freezer bags, trying to figure out how to dispose of the sugary mountain before I succumbed to temptation and ate myself into a dental emergency. Soren wandered into the dining room, staring blankly at the massive pile of crinkling, brightly colored wrappers. The rich, heavy scent of milk chocolate and roasted peanuts hung thick in the air. "We need to get this out of the house," I told him, tossing a heavy handful of caramel bars into a plastic bag. "Take it to the warehouse. Leave it in the breakroom. Mechanics and warehouse guys will eat anything." Soren blinked, his eyes slowly focusing on the glistening pile of sweets. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, a slow, incredibly wicked grin began to spread across his face, lifting the corners of his mouth into a smile I rarely saw. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed the perfect surgical instrument for a very specific job. He reached past the plastic bags and grabbed a heavy, thick-cut glass serving bowl from the china cabinet. He began filling it, meticulously selecting the best pieces from the pile. He packed it to the absolute brim, ensuring the foil wrappers caught the light, creating a dazzling, irresistible mountain of free sugar. "Oh," Soren murmured, his voice practically purring with anticipation. "I will absolutely take this to work." The next morning, Soren arrived at the warehouse 15 minutes early. The air in the backroom was still cold and stagnant, the overhead fluorescent tubes flickering and humming as they warmed up. He walked straight past his inventory cage and headed directly for the shipping desk. Bram, Tamsin, and Cormac were already there. True to form, they were not working. Bram was leaning against a filing cabinet, sipping from an oversized insulated mug, while Tamsin scrolled through her phone, complaining loudly about the traffic on her commute. Cormac was leaning over Tamsin's shoulder, nodding sympathetically. Soren approached the desk, holding the heavy glass bowl in both hands. The crinkle of the cellophane wrappers was loud in the quiet warehouse, a sharp, metallic rustling that instantly drew 3 pairs of eyes. He set the heavy bowl down on the edge of the shipping desk. The glass made a dull, heavy thud against the faux wood laminate. It was a masterpiece of temptation. The brightly colored wrappers gleamed under the harsh overhead lights. The sheer volume of the high-tier candy was undeniable. It was a beacon of mid-morning sugar, completely free for the taking. Bram stopped mid-sip. His eyes locked onto the bowl, widening with the instinctual, opportunistic greed of a man who never passed up a free snack. Tamsin lowered her phone, her posture immediately straightening. "Ooh, candy," Tamsin chirped, her usual sour demeanor vanishing in an instant. She reached her hand out, her acrylic nails clicking together in anticipation. Bram pushed off the filing cabinet, taking a heavy step toward the desk. "Nice one, Soren. I was just thinking I needed a sugar hit." He reached out a thick, calloused hand toward a bright orange package of peanut butter cups. Cormac was right behind them, a greedy smile plastered on his face. Soren waited exactly 1 second. He waited until their fingers were mere inches from the glittering wrappers. He waited until they had fully committed to the taking. Then with a smooth, casual motion, Soren grabbed the rim of the heavy glass bowl and slid it precisely 2 feet backward, pulling it completely out of their reach. Bram's hand closed around empty air. Tamsin's fingers stopped short, her nails hovering over the bare laminate of the desk. They both looked up at Soren, their faces registering a bizarre mixture of confusion and offended shock. Soren looked back at them. His expression was perfectly neutral, his eyes deadpan and utterly devoid of amusement. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't scowl. He simply looked at the 3 of them and delivered his line with the cool, effortless precision of a sniper. "Oh, I would offer this to you," Soren said, his voice entirely conversational, "but I know you don't believe in getting handouts." The silence that slammed into the room was absolute. It was thick, heavy, and incredibly suffocating. The dull hum of the overhead lights suddenly sounded deafening. Tamsin's mouth fell slightly open, her eyes darting from the bowl to Soren's face as her brain struggled to process the sheer audacity of his words. The memory of her own sneering voice from the day before, condemning freeloaders and handouts, practically materialized in the space between them. Bram's face, usually a dull, flushed pink, rapidly shifted to a deep, mottled crimson. The muscles in his thick neck locked tight. He opened his mouth to speak, to fire back a retort, to defend his hypocrisy, but absolutely nothing came out. The cognitive dissonance had short-circuited his brain. He was a man fiercely opposed to free stuff, explicitly demanding free stuff and being denied it using his own twisted logic. Cormac just stood there, completely frozen, looking terrified to even breathe. Soren didn't linger to gloat. He didn't wait for them to untangle their own hypocrisy. He picked up the heavy glass bowl, turned his back on the paralyzed trio and walked away. He carried the overflowing bowl of candy straight out of the dark, rubber-scented warehouse and pushed through the heavy double doors into the bright, sunlit showroom up front. He walked right up to the polished mahogany customer counter and set the bowl down squarely in the middle, right next to the cash register. For the rest of the day, Soren found reasons to work the front counter. And for the rest of the day, he enjoyed the finest, most satisfying show of his entire professional life. Every contractor, every landscaper, and every delivery driver who walked through the front doors saw the massive bowl of candy. Their faces lit up. They thanked Soren profusely, grabbing handfuls of chocolate to stuff into their pockets before heading back out to their trucks. Soren smiled warmly at every single one of them, engaging in cheerful small talk, actively encouraging them to take more. And the absolute best part was the architecture of the building. The wall separating the warehouse from the showroom featured a long, rectangular plexiglass window. From the shipping desk in the back room, Bram, Tamsin, and Cormac had a direct, unobstructed view of the front counter. Every time a customer reached into the bowl, taking the free, delicious handouts that the trio had been denied, Soren could see them out of the corner of his eye. They sat at their desk, practically vibrating with fury, glaring through the scratched plexiglass like angry, resentful zoo animals watching a feast they couldn't touch. They fumed, they sulked. They spent 8 full hours marinating in the bitter, inescapable juice of their own hypocritical standards. Not once did they dare walk up to the front counter to ask for a piece. Soren had effectively trapped them in a prison built entirely out of their own words. When Soren came home that night, he didn't look tired. He looked 10 years younger. He walked into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and recounted the entire saga with a quiet, glowing satisfaction. He had defeated the office bullies not by shouting, not by filing a complaint with human resources, but by simply holding up a mirror to their own absurd philosophy and letting them starve on it. I love my husband deeply, but in that moment, seeing the pure, unadulterated joy of petty karma dancing in his eyes, I had never loved him more. Hypocrisy always carries a bitter aftertaste, especially when it costs you the very thing you suddenly realize you want. It is remarkably easy for people to demand that others pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right until someone else is holding a bowl of premium chocolate just out of their reach. True character isn't defined by what you complain about when you think no one is listening. It's defined by how you treat the people around you when the chips, or the peanut butter cups, are down. If you enjoyed this story of perfectly executed, petty workplace karma, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share your own stories of dealing with hypocritical coworkers in the comments below. Until next time, keep your ears open, hold onto your candy, and never let the loudest voices in the room dictate your peace of mind.